The sprawling estate of the Kain family was the kind of place that inspired whispers. The opulence felt haunted, like something dark had entwined itself in the very foundations. Coral Kain, with her flawless pearls and perfectly coiffed hair, exuded an air of detachment, while her husband Marcus was the epitome of a self-made man who now measured the world in dollars and deals. Their son, Nick, was an enigma, a prodigy with a chessboard, but a storm of emotions off it. His piercing gaze could unsettle even the most confident adult. The opening scene of the film depicted an unsettling mystery. The family cat Snowball, found lifeless in the garden. Coral tried to console Nick, but the boy's eyes were vacant, his fingers twitching over a knight from his chess set. Marcus's voice echoed from the study, calling for someone to fix the boy. This is when Julio entered their lives. Julio Morales was a soft-spoken psychologist with a reputation for unraveling the most tangled of minds. Hired to work with Nick, he was briefed on the boy's brilliance, but also warned about his unpredictable moods. "He's a genius," Marcus had said, a glass of bourbon in hand, "but he's difficult. Fix him and you'll be well compensated." Coral's gaze lingered on Julio longer than necessary, her smile thin but mysterious. Julio's first session with Nick was tense. The boy's chessboard was set up and his pieces were already in mid-game. "Play me," Nick said, not looking up. The psychologist accepted the challenge, but every move was met with icy calculation. "You're predictable," Nick remarked after a swift checkmate. "You think in straight lines." The boy's words lingered with Julio, who began to suspect that Nick's troubles went beyond typical teenage rebellion. There were flashes of brilliance, yes, but also something darker. Nick spoke in riddles, often hinting at hidden tensions within the family. "Mom cries when no one's watching," he said one day, moving a pawn forward. "And Dad? He'd rather lose me than admit he's wrong." Julio began to piece together the Kain family dynamics. Coral was loving but distant, her attention fragmented by her own unhappiness. Marcus was a strict patriarch whose love was conditional upon success. And Nick? He carried the weight of their unspoken expectations. Then came the moment that changed everything. Nick, in the middle of a session, leaned forward and whispered, "You should meet Andrew. He's the only one who gets me." Julio was confused until Nick explained that Andrew was his chess coach, someone he revered but rarely saw. Julio decided to dig deeper, reaching out to Andrew despite Marcus's stern warning to keep things professional. But Julio knew that breaking through to Nick required understanding his world, and chess was its core. As Julio's sessions with Nick continued, the psychologist began to notice Coral's growing interest in their conversations. She'd linger after sessions, offering tea and soft smiles. Julio, initially dismissive of her advances, found himself drawn to her. The lines between professional and personal began to blur, creating ripples that would soon turn into waves. Andrew's home was as unassuming as he was. A small bungalow tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, it stood in stark contrast to the Kain mansion. Julio knocked hesitantly, unsure of what to expect. When the door opened, he was greeted by a wiry man with sharp eyes that seemed to assess him instantly. "You must be Julio," Andrew said, his voice steady. "Come in." The interior of the house was sparse but functional, with a chessboard taking center stage on the coffee table. As Julio sat down, Andrew wasted no time. "Nick is special," he began, moving a bishop on the board absent-mindedly. "But he's also troubled. Genius and madness often share a thin line." Julio listened as Andrew recounted his time with Nick. The boy had an uncanny ability to see patterns, to predict moves before they happened. But there was also a darkness in him, a relentless drive to win at all costs. "He doesn't just play chess," Andrew said. "He lives it. Every game is a battle, and he'll do anything to come out on top." The conversation shifted to the Kain family. Andrew's expression grew somber. "That house," he hesitated. "It's not a place for healing. Too many shadows, too many secrets." He warned Julio about getting too involved, but the psychologist was undeterred. "I'm here to help." "Nick," Julio replied firmly. "Whatever it takes." Back at the mansion, Nick's sessions grew more intense. The boy's emotional walls began to crack, revealing glimpses of vulnerability. "Sometimes I feel like a pawn," he admitted one evening, staring at the chessboard. "Like I'm being moved around and I don't know why." Julio's connection with Coral also deepened. Their conversations grew longer, their glances lingering. One evening, as they stood in the garden, Coral confessed, "I feel trapped, Julio. This life, this house, it's suffocating." Her voice trembled, and Julio found himself reaching for her hand. The fragile balance of their relationships was shattered when Marcus caught sight of them through the window. His fury was immediate and explosive, setting off a chain of events that would force everyone to confront the truths they'd been avoiding. Marcus's outburst at seeing Coral and Julio in the garden sent shockwaves through the household. That evening, the mansion was filled with shouting, accusations, and slammed doors. Coral, tearful but defiant, stood her ground. "You've ignored this family for years, Marcus. Don't act like you care now," she fired back. Nick, watching from the staircase, clutched a rook tightly in his hand, his knuckles white. Julio tried to mediate, but Marcus turned on him. "This is your fault," he spat. "You're supposed to help my son, not meddle in my marriage." The tension reached a boiling point, and Julio knew staying in the house was no longer tenable. He packed his things that night, but before leaving, he sought out Nick. Nick was in his room, his chessboard scattered as if a violent game had ended mid-match. He looked up as Julio entered. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Nick asked quietly. Julio nodded, struggling to find the right words. "I'll still be here for you, Nick, no matter what happens." Nick's expression hardened. "You don't get it. Nobody stays. Not really." The next day, Julio met Andrew one last time to discuss Nick. They agreed that the boy needed space to heal, away from the oppressive weight of the Kain household. Julio promised to check in, but a sense of failure gnawed at him. Back at the mansion, Nick's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He spent hours locked in his room, playing chess against himself. Coral, now distant from Marcus, tried to reach out to her son, but her efforts were met with cold indifference. Marcus, on the other hand, buried himself in work, avoiding the escalating tension at home. The breaking point came during a family dinner. Nick, unprovoked, tipped over a glass of wine, letting it spill across the pristine tablecloth. As the red liquid spread, he declared, "This family is like this stain. It doesn't matter how much you try to clean it up. It's ruined." Marcus erupted, slamming his fist on the table. "That's enough," he bellowed. But Nick, unfazed, stood and walked out, leaving his parents in stunned silence. Later that night, Coral found Nick in the garden, staring at the spot where Snowball had been buried. "Do you think things can ever go back to the way they were?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Coral, tears streaming down her face, hugged her son tightly. "We'll find a way," she whispered. "I promise," as the camera panned out. The mansion stood shrouded in darkness, its secret still simmering beneath the surface. The story of the Kains was far from over, but for now the pieces were still on the board, waiting for the next move. Nick disappeared the following morning. His room was empty, save for the scattered chess pieces on his board, a final game that remained unfinished. Coral and Marcus were paralyzed by the loss. Coral's grief was raw and immediate, while Marcus retreated further into himself, his anger and guilt threatening to consume him. A letter arrived 2 days later, addressed to Julio. It bore no return address but carried Nick's unmistakable handwriting. "I've gone to find answers," it read. "Don't look for me. This is my game now." The words haunted Julio, who struggled with whether to honor Nick's request or intervene. Meanwhile, Coral's desperation drove her to reach out to Andrew, hoping the chess mentor might have some insight. Andrew, while hesitant, admitted he'd seen this coming. "Nick's been searching for something, not just in chess, but in life," he explained. "He's trying to break free of the rules everyone else imposes." Marcus, overhearing the conversation, dismissed Andrew's words as nonsense. "He's just a kid," Marcus barked. "He doesn't know what he wants." But Coral saw the truth in Andrew's statement. She resolved to follow her son's trail, no matter where it led. Julio, despite his reservations, joined Coral on her search. The two visited chess tournaments, libraries, and city parks where chess enthusiasts gathered. Clues led them to a national tournament in New York, where Nick had registered under a pseudonym. As Coral and Julio watched him play, they saw a side of Nick they'd never witnessed before, confident, unyielding, and entirely in control. Nick's final match was against a grandmaster, an intense battle that drew a captivated crowd. Move by move, Nick dismantled his opponent's strategy, his brilliance on full display. When the match ended in his victory, Nick looked up and locked eyes with Coral and Julio in the audience. For a fleeting moment, there was recognition, and then he walked away without a word. Back at the mansion, the weight of Nick's absence lingered. Coral and Marcus began to rebuild their relationship, acknowledging their failures as parents. Julio, having crossed the boundaries of his professional role, chose to step back, though his connection to Coral remained unresolved. Months later, a package arrived at the Kain estate. Inside was a chessboard with a note from Nick. "The game isn't over." It was both a challenge and a promise, leaving the Kains to ponder their next moves in the intricate game of family and forgiveness.